Let the janitor play it. The man said it as a joke. The audience laughed. 15 minutes later, nobody in the concert hall could remember why it had seemed funny. The grand auditorium of Montgomery Hall glowed beneath crystal chandeliers and warm golden stage lights. More than 1,000 guests filled the velvet seats. Wealthy donors, music professors, local celebrities, and lifelong patrons of the arts filled the room with polite conversations and the soft rustle of expensive evening attire. Everyone had come to hear a celebrated performance. Nobody had come to see the janitor. Ethan Parker stood near the side of the stage holding a broom. His faded maintenance uniform blended into the background so completely that most people never noticed him. That was normal. People noticed conductors. They noticed soloists. They noticed executives and donors. They rarely noticed the man who arrived before sunrise to clean the floors and stayed after midnight to lock the doors. Ethan preferred it that way. He quietly swept the edge of the backstage corridor while stagehands rushed around preparing for the evening program. A few feet away sat an old Steinway grand piano that had been brought out from storage earlier that afternoon. It was not the instrument scheduled for the concert. It was simply a backup. An old piano, forgotten by most, much like the man standing beside it. At the center of the auditorium, Claire Montgomery reviewed the evening schedule with calm professionalism. As the artistic director of Montgomery Hall and one of the most respected pianists in the state, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her elegant black dress reflected the stage lights as she moved between performers and organizers. Every detail mattered to her. Every note, every chair, every light cue. Music deserved respect. Unfortunately, not everyone in the room shared that attitude. Near the front row, a wealthy donor named Richard Lawson leaned back in his seat and complained loudly enough for others to hear. "How much longer are we waiting?" Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. Claire approached with a diplomatic smile. "There is a minor technical delay. We will begin shortly." Richard rolled his eyes. Maybe the old piano needs a miracle. A few people chuckled. The joke should have ended there. But then his gaze landed on Ethan. The janitor happened to be dusting near the edge of the stage. Richard smirked. "Or maybe the janitor can play it." More laughter followed. Some guests laughed because they thought it was funny. Others laughed because wealthy people were laughing. Ethan continued working as though he had not heard the comment. Claire did hear it. A flicker of irritation crossed her face. She disliked arrogance almost as much as she disliked disrespect. Yet before she could respond, another voice joined the teasing. "Come on," someone called from the audience. "Let him try." More laughter. More smiles. Ethan lowered the broom slowly. The old piano sat only a few feet away. Stage lights reflected across its polished black surface. For a brief moment, his eyes lingered on the keys. Then he looked away. Claire noticed. Something about that look caught her attention. It was not embarrassment. It was not nervousness. It looked more like memory. Richard laughed again. "What is the worst that could happen?" The audience chuckled. Ethan remained silent. The room expected awkwardness. Maybe a nervous refusal. Maybe an embarrassed smile. Instead, the janitor simply stood still. The laughter gradually faded. Claire watched him carefully. There was something unusual about the calmness in his expression. Most people became uncomfortable when an entire auditorium looked at them. Ethan did not. He looked toward the piano again. The old Steinway seemed to pull at something buried deep inside him. A memory. A promise. A life he no longer discussed. Claire stepped closer. "You do not have to do this," she said quietly. Ethan met her eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he glanced toward a small photograph partially visible inside his wallet. A smiling young girl. Lily, his daughter. The most important person in his world. He slowly slipped the wallet back into his pocket. Around them, the concert hall waited. Hundreds of faces watched. Hundreds of expectations filled the air. Ethan placed the broom against the wall. Then he walked toward the piano. The audience laughed one last time. They thought they were about to watch a janitor play a few clumsy notes for fun. Claire watched him sit on the piano bench. Something in her chest told her they were all about to witness something entirely different. Ethan Parker had spent the last 7 years becoming invisible. Long before the polished floors of Montgomery Hall reflected stage lights and expensive shoes, he arrived with a ring of maintenance keys clipped to his belt and a thermos of coffee that was never quite hot enough. While musicians slept, Ethan unlocked side entrances. While executives prepared speeches, he emptied trash bins. While audiences admired the beauty of the concert hall, he quietly repaired the things nobody noticed. Most people assumed that was all he knew how to do. Most people never looked beyond the uniform. The truth was that Ethan preferred it that way. Earlier that same morning, before the laughter and before the piano, he had pushed his maintenance cart through the silent corridors of the hall. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, painting long golden stripes across the marble floors. The building felt different before the crowds arrived. Softer, honest. The walls seemed to breathe with memories of old performances and forgotten applause. Ethan moved carefully between rows of seats, collecting abandoned programs from the previous evening. He worked with the calm rhythm of someone who understood that every task deserved respect. A loose hinge mattered. A burned-out light bulb mattered. A scuffed floor mattered. Small things became important when people cared enough to notice them. That was one lesson life had taught him well. A young security guard passed him near the lobby. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning, Ben. Big concert tonight." Ethan smiled faintly. "That is what I hear. You ever get tired of listening to rehearsals all day?" Ethan looked toward the distant stage. "Not really." Ben laughed. "You are probably the only janitor in America who says that." Ethan simply smiled and continued walking. He did not mention that music had once been the center of his world. He did not mention that there had been a time when he recognized concert halls by their acoustics the way other people recognized neighborhoods by street signs. Those conversations belonged to another life. The maintenance office sat beneath the stage in a narrow hallway lined with storage rooms and utility closets. Inside, Ethan kept his belongings in a small metal locker. A photograph of Lily was taped to the inside door. In the picture, she stood proudly beside a science fair project, smiling as though she had just discovered something wonderful. Ethan looked at the photograph every morning. Some people needed motivational speeches. Some needed trophies. Ethan only needed that picture. His phone vibrated softly. A text message appeared. "Good luck at work today, Dad." Ethan smiled immediately. "Good luck at school, kiddo." A moment later, another message arrived. "Do not forget parent night on Thursday." As if I could. "Promise?" "Promise." Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket and returned to work. The promise mattered. Everything else came second. By late afternoon, Montgomery Hall had transformed. Delivery trucks arrived. Technicians adjusted lighting equipment. Musicians wheeled instrument cases through backstage corridors. Elegant guests would soon fill every seat. Ethan spent the next several hours moving quietly through the organized chaos. Nobody paid much attention to him. A stage manager hurried past without looking up. A donor nearly bumped into him while talking on the phone. Two guests asked him for directions and forgot him the moment he answered. Ethan did not mind. Invisibility had advantages. People revealed their true character when they believed nobody important was watching. He had learned that lesson too. Near sunset, he stopped beside the old Steinway piano that had been moved from storage. Dust particles floated through the warm light above its polished surface. Ethan ran a cloth gently across the edge of the instrument. His movement slowed. For a brief moment, his reflection appeared in the black finish. Not the janitor everyone saw. Not the man pushing a broom through empty hallways. Something older. Something buried. His fingers lingered near the keys without touching them. Then, footsteps approached and the moment disappeared. Ethan picked up the cloth and returned to work. The old piano remained behind him, waiting, silent, patient, as though it recognized him long before anyone else did. Nearly 20 miles away from Montgomery Hall, Lily Parker sat at a worn wooden desk near the window of a small yellow house. Afternoon sunlight spilled across her homework papers and colored pencils. Outside, a maple tree swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, the house felt quiet in the familiar way it always did when her father was working. Lily glanced at the clock hanging above the kitchen doorway. Then she smiled to herself. She knew exactly what Ethan was probably doing at that moment. Cleaning something, fixing something, helping someone without expecting recognition. It was almost a family tradition. At 11 years old, Lily understood more about sacrifice than many adults. She remembered long nights when her father came home exhausted, but still helped with school projects. She remembered mornings when he woke before sunrise to make pancakes shaped like stars because she had a science test and felt nervous. She remembered birthdays that were never extravagant, but somehow always felt magical. Ethan had never promised her a perfect life. He had simply promised that he would always show up. And somehow, that mattered more. Earlier that morning, before leaving for school, Lily had found him standing in the kitchen making coffee. "Big concert tonight?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Looks that way. Fancy people again?" "Probably." Lily laughed softly. "Do they ever realize you know more about music than most of them?" Ethan shook his head. "That is not important." "It should be." Ethan reached over and adjusted a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Being kind is important. Being dependable is important. Everything else comes later." Lily rolled her eyes the way children often do when they secretly agree with their parents. "You always say things like that." "Because they are true." Now, sitting alone at her desk hours later, she thought about that conversation. On the wall above her desk hung several framed photographs. Most showed ordinary moments: school events, camping trips, ice cream stands during summer afternoons. Yet one photograph always caught her attention. It sat slightly apart from the others. In the picture, Ethan looked much younger. He wore a dark suit instead of a maintenance uniform. Behind him stood a grand piano beneath bright stage lights. The image had faded over time. The frame showed signs of age. But Lily had noticed something years ago. Whenever her father looked at that picture, his smile became different. Softer, sadder, as though he remembered a song nobody else could hear. She had asked him about it once. "Were you famous?" Ethan laughed. "Not even close." "Then why are you playing piano in that picture?" "Because I used to enjoy it." "Used to?" Ethan had looked out the window for a moment before answering. Sometimes life gives you new priorities. Lily did not fully understand the answer back then. She understood it now. Her father had traded one dream for another, and he never complained about the exchange. Across town, evening slowly approached. Traffic increased around Montgomery Hall. Guests began arriving in expensive cars. Photographers prepared near the entrance. The city buzzed with anticipation for the concert. Meanwhile, Lily finished her homework and placed her books neatly inside her backpack. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Concert starting soon. Behave yourself." Lily smiled immediately. "I always behave myself." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "That is not what your teacher said last month." Lily laughed out loud. One detention for talking too much was apparently enough to become family history. She typed back, "Love you, Dad." The response came almost instantly. "Love you too, kiddo." The simple exchange lasted less than 20 seconds. Yet it carried more meaning than entire speeches. Neither of them knew that before the night ended, hundreds of strangers would learn something Lily had known for years. The quiet man pushing a broom through concert hall corridors was not defined by his job title. He was defined by his heart. Back inside Montgomery Hall, Ethan sat on the piano bench while laughter faded around him. The old Steinway waited beneath warm stage lights. The audience expected entertainment. Claire watched from a few feet away. Something about the moment felt strangely important. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the keys. For a brief second, he thought about Lily sitting at home. Then he placed his hands above the piano, and the memories he had spent years keeping silent began to wake. Claire Montgomery had spent most of her life around extraordinary musicians. She had studied under masters whose names appeared in textbooks. She had performed in concert halls across the country. She had heard child prodigies, award-winning composers, and virtuosos capable of astonishing technical precision. Talent rarely surprised her anymore. Dedication impressed her. Character impressed her. But raw musical ability had become familiar territory. That was why the feeling growing in her chest, as Ethan sat before the old Steinway, unsettled her. She could not explain it. The audience still expected a joke. Richard Lawson leaned back in his seat with an amused smile. Several guests whispered to one another. A few people lifted their phones, hoping to capture an awkward moment. They expected hesitation. They expected embarrassment. They expected the janitor to press a few random notes before laughing and walking away. Ethan remained motionless on the piano bench. The stage lights cast a warm glow across the polished black surface of the instrument. Dust particles drifted through the air like tiny stars. The hall felt strangely quiet. Claire watched Ethan's hands. There was something unusual about them. They were not the hands of a man unfamiliar with a piano. The fingers rested above the keys with calm confidence. No tension, no uncertainty, just patience. The same patience she had seen in experienced musicians' moments before a performance. Ethan lowered his eyes. For an instant, the noise of the room seemed distant. The laughter, the whispers, The expectations. All of it faded behind memories he had spent years avoiding. He remembered another stage, another piano, another life. He remembered a woman sitting in the front row with a smile that always made him less nervous. He remembered promises, whispered backstage after concerts. He remembered dreams that once felt permanent. Then he remembered a hospital room. Silence. Loss. The day everything changed. His jaw tightened slightly. Not from anger. From memory. Claire noticed. The expression vanished almost immediately, but she had seen it. Whatever story this man carried, it ran deeper than anyone realized. A stage technician approached her quietly. Should we stop this? Claire kept her eyes on Ethan. No, what if he damages the piano? Claire shook her head. He will not. The technician looked confused. How do you know? Claire did not answer because she was not entirely sure herself. She simply knew. Ethan took a slow breath. The old Steinway felt familiar beneath his fingertips. Too familiar. Years had passed since he had sat before an audience. Years since he had allowed himself to think about music as anything more than a memory. Music had once been tied to dreams. Then it became tied to grief. Eventually, it became tied to promises. Promises made to a little girl who needed stability more than applause. Promises made to himself. Yet the piano waited patiently beneath his hands as though no time had passed at all. Richard laughed again from the front row. Come on, give us something. A few scattered chuckles followed. Ethan never looked up. Claire felt irritation rise again, but before she could respond, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was calm. Are you sure? The question surprised everyone. Richard smirked. Absolutely. More laughter drifted through the room. Ethan nodded once. All right. The answer was simple, almost gentle, yet something about it caused the room to settle. Claire felt it immediately. The atmosphere changed in a way she could not explain. Ethan straightened slightly on the bench. The old piano seemed less like a prop now and more like an old friend. Across the hall, conversations faded. Guests adjusted in their seats. A few people who had been looking at their phones suddenly looked up. The room was not silent yet, but it was moving towards silence. Claire folded her arms and studied him carefully. She realized she wanted him to play. Not because she expected entertainment, because she wanted answers. The man pushing a broom through hallways should not carry himself like this. He should not sit at a piano like this. He should not look at an audience like someone who had faced larger audiences before. Ethan placed both hands gently above the keys. The movement was effortless, natural, familiar. His eyes closed briefly. Somewhere 20 miles away, Lily sat in her room, finishing homework, completely unaware that the past her father had hidden for years was about to step into the light. Back inside the concert hall, every expectation in the room balanced on a single moment. Ethan opened his eyes. The old Steinway waited. The audience waited. Claire waited. Then, at last, his fingers touched the first key. The first note was so soft that some people almost missed it. It drifted through the concert hall like a memory rather than a sound. A single tone, pure, gentle, unhurried. The laughter that had lingered moments earlier faded immediately, not because anyone was impressed yet, because the note did not belong to the performance they expected. Ethan allowed the sound to hang in the air. Then he played another, and another. The old Steinway responded with a warmth that seemed impossible for an instrument that had spent years hidden in storage. The piano did not sound old anymore. It sounded alive. Claire felt the change first. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. The phrasing was unusual, not technically difficult, not dramatic, simply beautiful. Every note arrived exactly where it belonged. No rushing, no hesitation, just confidence wrapped in restraint. Ethan kept his gaze on the keys. The auditorium disappeared around him. The audience disappeared. The chandeliers disappeared. Even the stage lights faded from awareness. There was only the music and the memories traveling inside it. His fingers moved with effortless familiarity. Years had passed since he had allowed himself to play this way. Yet the language of music had never left him. Some skills fade. Some disappear entirely. Others become part of who a person is. This was one of those things. A woman in the third row slowly lowered her phone. A man near the back stopped whispering to his companion. One by one, conversations disappeared. Not because anyone requested silence. Because the music invited it. Claire glanced toward Richard Lawson. The wealthy donor no longer looked amused. He looked confused. The joke was already becoming something else. Ethan continued. The melody expanded gradually, like sunlight spreading across a quiet lake at dawn. The left hand carried a steady heartbeat beneath the surface while the right hand painted delicate phrases above it. Every movement looked natural, comfortable, familiar. Claire folded her arms tighter. A question had begun forming in her mind. How? She knew hundreds of accomplished musicians. She knew teachers, performers, conductors, and composers. Nobody learned to play like this by accident. Nobody developed this level of control while working maintenance shifts. Her eyes never left Ethan's hands. The fingers barely seemed to touch the keys. Yet every note carried emotion. Not performance. Not technique. Emotion. There was a difference, and Claire knew it immediately. Several audience members leaned forward in their seats. Others sat perfectly still. The atmosphere inside the hall continued changing. It felt less like a concert and more like a confession. Ethan's expression remained calm, but behind that calmness, memories flowed through every phrase. He remembered teaching Lily's simple melodies on a small keyboard when she was 7 years old. He remembered hearing her laugh when she missed notes and invented new ones. He remembered evenings when music filled their little house after difficult days. Those memories carried warmth. But there were older memories too. Memories of a woman sitting beside him on a piano bench long after midnight. Memories of dreams once shared. The melody deepened. The audience felt it even if they could not explain why. Claire felt it most of all. The music was telling a story, not with words, with honesty. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The man who had laughed the loudest now stared at the stage in complete silence. Around him, the same transformation spread through the hall. More than 1,000 people sat listening. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody whispered. Nobody laughed. Ethan's hands moved farther across the keyboard now. The melody climbed higher. The notes shimmered beneath the stage lights. The old Steinway seemed to awaken completely, releasing sounds so rich and expressive that even experienced musicians in the audience exchanged surprised glances. Claire recognized something else now. Discipline. Years of it. The kind of discipline built through countless hours alone with a piano. The kind of discipline nobody could fake. Her heart beat slightly faster. She had expected awkwardness, then curiosity. Now she felt something closer to disbelief. The janitor should not be playing this way. Yet there he sat, transforming an old forgotten piano into the center of the universe. Ethan reached the end of a phrase and allowed the final note to linger. The silence afterward felt almost sacred. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody even adjusted in their seats. The hall seemed to forget how to breathe. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. The song was only beginning. But already the room no longer saw a janitor. They simply had not realized it yet. The melody continued unfolding through the concert hall with a quiet confidence that felt almost impossible to resist. Ethan did not perform for the audience. He did not glance toward the wealthy donors in the front rows. He did not look at Claire. He seemed to be playing for something far more personal. The music flowed from memory, from loss, from gratitude, and from years of silence that had never truly disappeared. Each phrase carried the weight of a story nobody in the room knew. Yet somehow everyone could feel it. The old Steinway responded beautifully. Notes rose toward the ceiling and drifted through the grand auditorium like warm light through stained glass. The piano no longer sounded like an aging instrument pulled from storage. It sounded magnificent. A retired music professor seated near the center section slowly lowered his glasses. His eyes widened. He had spent 40 years teaching piano performance. He had heard thousands of musicians. Yet there was something unmistakable about the man on stage. The professor leaned toward the woman beside him. Listen to the control. She nodded without taking her eyes off Ethan. I am. No, the professor whispered. Really listen. The woman did. A moment later her expression changed. Across the hall, similar realizations were beginning to spread. Not because Ethan was playing loudly. Quite the opposite. The restraint was what made it remarkable. Every note arrived with purpose. Every pause meant something. Every phrase seemed to breathe. Claire stood near the side of the stage, completely motionless. The questions inside her mind continued multiplying. She recognized elements of the performance style. Certain transitions. Certain voicings. Certain emotional choices. They reminded her of recordings she had studied years ago at conservatory. recordings by musicians whose names still carried enormous respect in classical circles. Yet those performers belonged to another era, another generation. Ethan should not sound like them. And yet he did. Richard Lawson shifted in his seat again. His earlier confidence had vanished completely. He looked uncomfortable now, though not because of embarrassment. It was something deeper. The realization that he might have misjudged someone. People rarely enjoy confronting that feeling. Ethan continued playing. His shoulders remained relaxed. His breathing remained steady. The years between his present life and his former life seemed to dissolve with every measure. He remembered concert tours, long rehearsals, standing ovations. He remembered interviews he never enjoyed and expectations he never quite trusted. Then he remembered Lily's first piano recital. The nervous smile she gave him before playing 3 simple songs. The way she searched the audience until she found him. The way her confidence returned the moment their eyes met. Ethan smiled faintly as he played. Several audience members noticed. The smile transformed the music. Suddenly the melody felt warmer, brighter, less like grief and more like gratitude. Claire noticed that too. The performance was telling a story. Not a dramatic story. Not a tragic story. A human story. A story about losing something important and discovering something even more important afterward. The realization sent a chill through her. She could not remember the last time a performance affected her this way. Professional musicians often analyzed music while listening. They evaluated technique, structure, timing, interpretation. Yet Ethan made analysis feel irrelevant. The audience was no longer listening with their minds. They were listening with their hearts. In the balcony, a teenage piano student sat frozen beside her mother. She had spent years practicing scales and exercises. Watching Ethan felt different. For the first time, she understood that music was not merely about playing notes correctly. It was about saying something true. Down on stage, Ethan moved into a new section of the piece. The melody climbed higher. Rich harmonies filled the hall. The sound seemed larger now, though his touch remained gentle. Nobody moved. Hundreds of guests sat completely still. The waiters near the back of the auditorium had stopped walking. Even the stagehands watching from behind curtains remained frozen. Claire glanced across the room and realized something remarkable. The concert hall had become silent long before the music stopped. Not because anyone demanded silence. Because nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Ethan reached another phrase, ending, and allowed it to linger. The final note floated upward and slowly disappeared. The pause afterward felt endless. Sacred. Then Ethan began the next passage, and Claire's heart skipped unexpectedly. She knew that melody. Not from a concert. Not from a recording. From history. From a performance that had once captivated the entire classical music world. Suddenly, she was no longer wondering whether the janitor knew how to play piano. She was beginning to wonder if she had seen his face somewhere before. Claire's pulse quickened as the familiar melody continued flowing through the hall. She knew exactly where she had heard it before. Not from a recent performance. Not from a recording released last year. Much further back. During her conservatory days, one professor had played an old archival performance and called it one of the most emotionally honest interpretations he had ever heard. The pianist had been young, brilliant, mysterious. Then, almost overnight, he disappeared from the public eye. Claire remembered the discussion that followed. Students debated where he had gone. Some believed he retired. Others believed he moved overseas. Nobody seemed to know the truth. Yet standing on the stage only a few feet away, the janitor was using the same phrasing, the same delicate timing, the same impossible balance between restraint and emotion. Claire stared at him. The realization felt absurd, impossible, and yet the longer she listened, the harder it became to dismiss. Ethan remained completely unaware of the storm forming inside her thoughts. His attention never left the piano. The music had carried him somewhere else entirely. Every measure unlocked another memory. He remembered Lily taking her first steps across a living room floor. He remembered helping her ride a bicycle. He remembered late-night homework sessions and Saturday morning pancakes. Those memories filled him with warmth. Then another memory arrived. His wife sitting beside an old, upright piano years earlier, smiling as she listened to him practice. "Promise me something," she had said. "What?" "If life ever changes, do not let music disappear completely." Ethan had laughed back then. Life seemed too stable to imagine otherwise. Yet life had changed. More than either of them expected. His fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence. The melody grew richer. Layers of harmony unfolded beneath the main theme. The sound filled every corner of the hall. Audience members who had entered expecting a pleasant evening now sat completely captivated. A waiter near the rear entrance remained frozen beside a serving cart. Two photographers lowered their cameras because neither wanted to interrupt the moment. The entire room seemed united by the same silent question. Who is this man? Richard Lawson finally leaned toward the guest seated beside him. Do you know him? The guest shook his head. No. Have you heard him before? Never. Richard looked back toward the stage. For the first time that evening, he appeared genuinely uncomfortable. The joke had vanished long ago. What remained was the unsettling realization that he had mistaken humility for insignificance. Claire stepped closer to the edge of the stage. She studied Ethan's face carefully. The years had changed him. The maintenance uniform hid him. The gray beginning to appear near his temples altered his appearance. Yet something felt familiar. A memory sat just beyond reach. She almost had it. Almost. Then Ethan entered another passage. Claire's breath caught. There it was. A signature transition. One that few pianists ever attempted because it required extraordinary control. Her former professor used to reference it constantly. He even had a nickname for it. The Parker turn. Claire's eyes widened. Parker. The name struck her like a bell. She looked toward a concert program lying on a nearby chair. Then she looked back at Ethan. Parker. Ethan Parker. The room around her seemed to blur for a moment. No, it could not be. And yet every piece suddenly fit together. The technique, the phrasing, the emotional depth, the familiarity she could not place. Her heart pounded harder. Meanwhile, the audience remained completely absorbed. Nobody noticed Claire's growing shock. Nobody noticed the realization taking shape. They only heard the music. Ethan guided the melody upward into a soaring phrase that felt both hopeful and heartbreaking. Several listeners wiped tears from their eyes without fully understanding why. The music spoke directly to places words could never reach. It spoke about loss without bitterness, about love without sentimentality, about resilience without pride. Claire felt her throat tighten. She was no longer listening as an artistic director. She was listening as someone witnessing the return of a ghost. The final notes of the passage drifted into the air. Silence followed. Deep, complete, beautiful. Then Ethan began the next movement, and Claire no longer wondered whether she recognized him. Now she was certain. The quiet janitor sitting before the old Steinway was not merely an extraordinary pianist. He was the forgotten musician whose disappearance had become one of the great mysteries in the classical music world. Claire could barely hear her own thoughts over the realization unfolding inside her mind. Ethan Parker. The name echoed through memories she had not visited in years. During her final semester at conservatory, professors often spoke about him with a mixture of admiration and mystery. He had been one of the brightest talents of his generation. Critics praised his emotional depth. Audiences filled halls just to hear him perform. Then, without warning, he disappeared. No farewell tour. No public statement. No dramatic scandal. One day he was everywhere. The next day he was gone. Entire careers had been built analyzing recordings he left behind. Students studied his interpretations. Teachers debated his choices. Yet no one seemed to know what happened. And now he sat only a few feet away wearing a maintenance uniform and work boots. Claire felt almost dizzy. Ethan remained unaware of the discovery spreading through the room, one person at a time. The music had become larger now. Not louder, larger. The melody expanded across the hall like a living thing. Rich harmonies rose and fell beneath it. Every phrase seemed connected to something deeply personal. The audience listened with complete attention. Even those who knew nothing about classical music understood they were experiencing something rare. True artistry has a way of crossing barriers. It reaches people whether they can explain it or not. A woman near the front quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Beside her, her husband squeezed her hand without speaking. Several rows back, a teenage boy who had spent most of the evening looking bored now sat completely still. The music demanded nothing from them except honesty. And honesty was difficult to ignore. Ethan's fingers moved effortlessly across the keyboard. Years of silence vanished beneath each note. The old Steinway seemed incapable of hiding anything. Every memory, every regret, every gratitude, every lesson. The instrument transformed them into sound. Ethan remembered the day Lily was born. He remembered holding her for the first time and realizing that every priority in his life had instantly shifted. He remembered late-night feedings and first words, and tiny hands reaching for his finger. Those memories blended with the music. They always did. Music had once been his profession. Then it became his refuge. Eventually, it became his way of remembering what truly mattered. Claire took another step closer to the stage. Her eyes never left him. She could see details nobody else noticed. The relaxed shoulders, the absence of performance anxiety, the complete trust between musician and instrument. Ethan was not trying to impress anyone. That was what made the performance extraordinary. Great musicians often fought to be remembered. Ethan seemed content simply to tell the truth through the music and let the audience decide what to do with it. Richard Lawson lowered his gaze. The wealthy donor who had started the joke looked profoundly uncomfortable now. His earlier confidence had vanished entirely. The man sitting beside him leaned over and whispered something. Richard shook his head slowly. He had no answer. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the music. Near the back of the hall, the retired professor who recognized Ethan's skill sat frozen. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Years earlier, he had attended a competition where a young pianist stunned judges with an interpretation so moving that nobody spoke for nearly a minute afterward. The professor remembered the name now. Ethan Parker. His eyes widened. He looked toward Claire across the hall. Their gazes met briefly. The recognition in her expression confirmed everything. Neither needed words. They both knew. On stage, Ethan moved into the emotional center of the piece. The melody slowed. A gentle sequence of notes drifted into the air. The hall seemed to shrink around them. More than 1,000 people sat listening. Yet the music somehow felt intimate, personal, as though Ethan were speaking directly to each person individually. Claire felt her throat tighten again. She finally understood why the performance affected her so deeply. It was not merely beautiful. It was sincere. In a world filled with ambition, competition, and performance, sincerity felt almost revolutionary. Ethan reached the end of another phrase and allowed silence to settle. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seats. The entire auditorium seemed suspended in time. Then he began the next section, and Claire's heart nearly stopped. She recognized the piece completely now. It was not just any composition. It was the final work Ethan had publicly performed before vanishing from the music world. The piece many critics believed he would never play again. And suddenly Claire realized something even more important. This was not a concert for the audience. This was a promise being remembered. The promise had been made almost 12 years earlier in a quiet hospital room filled with fading afternoon light. Ethan remembered every detail of that day, even though he had spent years trying not to revisit it. The soft hum of medical equipment, the gentle squeeze of a hand growing weaker, the courage in a smile that somehow remained stronger than fear. As the melody flowed from the old Steinway, those memories returned with surprising clarity. The audience could not know what he was remembering, but they could hear it. That was the strange power of music. Sometimes it revealed truths that words could never carry. Claire stood frozen near the edge of the stage. She knew the history of the piece now. She knew the name of the man playing it. Yet something else had begun to trouble her. Every recording she had ever heard of Ethan Parker ended differently. They ended with ambition, with technical brilliance, with the confidence of a rising star. This performance felt different. Older, wiser, more human. It was as though the years away from the spotlight had not diminished him. They had deepened him. Ethan moved into another passage, and the melody seemed to glow beneath his fingertips. The notes carried warmth now. Not sadness, not grief. Warmth. He remembered Lily's first day of kindergarten. He remembered sitting in a tiny chair during school events because all the normal seats were taken. He remembered learning how to braid hair after watching online tutorials because there was no one else to do it. He remembered burned dinners, science projects, scraped knees, birthday cakes, bedtime stories, and thousands of ordinary moments that had quietly become the most extraordinary part of his life. The audience listened in complete silence. A woman in the balcony closed her eyes. A young couple near the back held hands. The retired professor leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single note. Around the hall, people stopped thinking about where Ethan worked or what he wore. The labels had disappeared. Only the music remained. Richard Lawson sat perfectly still. The man who had started the joke now looked almost ashamed. Several times he seemed ready to say something, then thought better of it. There was nothing he could say. The performance itself had become an answer to every assumption he had made. Claire slowly glanced around the auditorium. She had directed hundreds of performances inside Montgomery Hall. She knew how audiences behaved. People shifted in their seats. They coughed. They checked watches. They whispered occasionally. Tonight, none of those things were happening. More than 1,000 people sat completely absorbed. It was the kind of silence musicians dream about. Not forced silence. Earned silence. The highest compliment an audience can give. Ethan reached the emotional heart of the piece. The melody slowed again. Simpler now. More vulnerable. Every note seemed to hang in the air a little longer. The old Steinway responded beautifully, as though grateful to be heard again after years of waiting. Ethan thought about his wife. Not the sadness of losing her. The joy of having known her at all. He remembered her laughter. Her patience. Her belief in him even when he doubted himself. Most of all, he remembered the promise. Do not let music disappear completely. For years he believed he had broken that promise. He stopped performing. He stopped recording. He walked away from the career everyone expected him to pursue. Yet sitting here now, he finally understood something. Music had never disappeared. It lived in the lullabies he sang to Lily when she could not sleep. It lived in the little keyboard lessons they shared at home. It lived in every quiet moment of grace that followed difficult days. The promise had survived after all. Claire felt tears gathering unexpectedly. She rarely cried during performances. Years of professional experience had taught her how to analyze music objectively. Tonight, objectivity felt impossible. The sincerity in Ethan's playing bypassed analysis entirely. It reached something deeper. A stagehand standing behind the curtain wiped his eyes discreetly. A security guard near the rear entrance stared toward the stage without blinking. Even the servers waiting near the lobby remained motionless. The music had transformed the hall into something sacred. Ethan approached the final section of the piece. The melody began climbing upward again. Hope replaced reflection. Light replaced shadow. The audience could feel it. Claire could feel it. Everyone could. Yet beneath the beauty, another realization was spreading quietly through the room. This was not simply an exceptional performance. This was a man revealing who he truly was after years of choosing not to be seen. Ethan played the next phrase with gentle confidence. The notes shimmered beneath the chandeliers. The hall seemed to hold its breath. And somewhere in the silence between one measure and the next, the audience began to understand that they were witnessing a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. The final movement arrived with the quiet certainty of sunrise. Ethan felt it before he played the first note. The entire journey of the piece had been leading here. Every memory, every loss, every lesson, every moment of grace hidden inside ordinary years. His fingers settled into the opening phrase, and the old Steinway answered with a voice so rich that several people in the audience visibly straightened in their seats. The sound seemed larger now, filling every corner of Montgomery Hall without force. It did not demand attention. It simply deserved it. Claire stood motionless beside the stage. She no longer felt shock. The shock had passed. What remained was awe. She had spent years studying greatness, chasing excellence, building a career around extraordinary performances. Yet she could not remember the last time she witnessed something this honest. Ethan was not playing to impress anyone. He was not trying to reclaim a reputation. He was not seeking applause. That freedom gave the music a power few performers ever achieved. The audience felt it. Every person in the hall felt it. The melody climbed higher. The harmonies widened. Warm light reflected across the piano's polished surface while Ethan's hands moved with effortless precision. The years away from the stage had not diminished him. They had refined him. A younger version of Ethan might have played for perfection. The man sitting at the piano tonight played for truth. And truth was far more difficult to ignore. A young music student in the balcony stared at the stage with tears in her eyes. She could not explain why she was crying. The music simply reached something deep inside her. Nearby, an elderly couple sat hand in hand. They had attended concerts together for more than 40 years. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The music said everything. Richard Lawson lowered his head briefly. Embarrassment mixed with admiration. Earlier that evening, he had seen a janitor. Now he realized he had never truly seen the man at all. That realization carried its own weight. Around him, hundreds of guests sat perfectly still. The hall felt suspended between heartbeats. Ethan entered the most difficult section of the piece. Rapid passages flowed beneath his fingers with astonishing clarity. Yet even here, technique never overshadowed emotion. Every note served a purpose. Every phrase told part of the story. Claire recognized the section immediately. Years ago, critics called it nearly impossible to perform with both technical control and emotional depth. Ethan made it seem effortless, not because it was easy, because he had stopped trying to prove anything. The music surged forward. Energy filled the hall. Hope replaced sorrow completely now. The audience could feel the transformation. Ethan thought about Lily again. He pictured her smile, her determination, the way she believed in him without needing explanations. He remembered every school play, every science project, every late-night conversation across the kitchen table. Some people measured success through awards. Others measured it through wealth. Ethan measured it through moments like those. The realization flowed directly into the music. The melody rose higher still, stronger, brighter, more alive. Claire felt a tear slip down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. Several rows away, the retired professor simply shook his head in disbelief. He had spent decades teaching young musicians. Tonight, he was witnessing a master class in humanity disguised as a piano performance. The final climax approached. Ethan knew it. Claire knew it. Somehow the audience knew it too. The hall seemed to inhale collectively. The music expanded one last time, carrying every emotion that had come before it. Love, grief, gratitude, redemption, second chances, quiet dignity. They all lived inside the final passage. Ethan's hands moved across the keyboard with complete confidence. The old Steinway sang beneath the chandeliers. The last soaring phrase filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. Then came the final chord. Ethan pressed the keys gently. The sound resonated through the hall. Warm, full, complete. The chord lingered, slowly faded, then disappeared. Silence followed. Not ordinary silence. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence of people who had forgotten how to react. More than 1,000 guests sat frozen in place. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered. Nobody applauded. For several seconds, the entire concert hall remained perfectly still. Claire felt her heart pounding in the quiet. Richard stared at the stage. The retired professor stared at the stage. Every musician, donor, student, and guest stared at the stage. Ethan lowered his hands from the keys and sat peacefully on the bench. The music had ended, yet somehow the moment felt larger than any standing ovation. The hall was completely frozen, and for the first time all evening, everyone finally understood that they had not just heard a performance. They had witnessed a life. For several long seconds after the final chord faded away, nobody moved. The silence seemed almost unreal. It stretched across the concert hall like a living thing, wrapping itself around every seat, every chandelier, every person fortunate enough to be present. Ethan remained seated at the piano bench, with his hands resting quietly in his lap. His breathing was steady. His expression was calm. To him, the music had ended. To everyone else, something much larger had just begun. Claire Montgomery was the first person to move. Not because she wanted to break the silence, but because she finally understood the responsibility of the moment. She stepped toward the stage with tears still visible in her eyes. Around her, audience members slowly began returning to the present. A woman near the front wiped her face. A young piano student stared at Ethan with open admiration. The retired professor continued shaking his head in disbelief. Then, somewhere near the back of the hall, a single person stood. The sound of the chair folding upward echoed softly through the room. Another person stood. Then another. Within moments, hundreds of people rose to their feet. The applause arrived like a wave. Not loud at first, almost hesitant, then stronger, warmer, deeper. Soon the entire hall thundered with appreciation. More than 1,000 people stood applauding the man they had mistaken for a janitor only an hour earlier. Ethan looked up, surprised by the reaction. He offered a small nod of gratitude. Nothing more. The humility only made the audience admire him more. Claire walked directly onto the stage. The applause continued. She stopped beside the piano and looked at Ethan for several seconds. "It was you," she said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "I suppose there is no hiding it now." Claire laughed softly through her emotions. "Ethan Parker, The name carried through the nearby microphones. Several audience members exchanged confused glances. Others immediately reacted. A few older musicians gasped. The retired professor closed his eyes and smiled. He had known he was right. Claire turned toward the audience. Many years ago, before I ever became artistic director of this hall, there was a pianist whose performances inspired an entire generation of musicians. The room grew quiet again. His recordings are still studied today. His interpretations are still discussed in conservatories around the country. She looked back toward Ethan. And tonight, without planning it, we were given the privilege of hearing him again. A wave of whispers spread across the hall. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. He never enjoyed public attention. He never had. The applause returned, louder than before. Yet Claire noticed something important. Ethan did not look proud. He looked almost uncomfortable. Not because he disliked recognition. Because recognition had stopped being important to him years ago. Backstage, several staff members rushed toward office computers. Curiosity spread quickly. Within minutes, old articles began appearing on screens. Archived interviews, competition results, concert reviews, newspaper photographs from years earlier. Everywhere they looked, the same name appeared. Ethan Parker, rising star, musical prodigy, international talent, future legend. The descriptions seemed almost impossible to connect with the quiet man who spent his mornings cleaning hallways and repairing loose hinges. A stage manager stared at an old photograph on a computer screen. That is him. Another employee leaned closer. No way. Look. The younger version of Ethan smiled from the article. The resemblance was undeniable. Across the hall, Richard Lawson remained standing near the front row. His applause had stopped. His expression carried the weight of self-reflection. Finally, he walked toward the stage. Several people watched curiously. Ethan stood as Richard approached. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Richard extended his hand. I owe you an apology. Ethan looked at the offered hand. Then he shook it. You do not owe me anything. Richard shook his head. I judged you before I knew you. Ethan smiled gently. Most people did. There was no bitterness in his voice. No anger. No desire to embarrass anyone. Only grace. That grace affected Richard more than any criticism ever could. Claire watched the exchange carefully. It revealed something she was only beginning to understand. The most remarkable thing about Ethan Parker was not his talent. It was his character. Talent explained the music. Character explained the man. As the audience slowly settled back into their seats, conversations filled the hall. Yet one question now echoed through every corner of the building. If Ethan Parker had once stood on the edge of worldwide recognition, why had he disappeared? Why would someone walk away from everything musicians spend their entire lives chasing? Claire already knew she needed that answer. And somewhere deep inside, she suspected the answer had nothing to do with music and everything to do with love. The applause continued long after most performances would have ended. People who had arrived expecting an ordinary evening remained seated, standing, or simply staring at the stage as though they were afraid the moment might disappear if they looked away. Ethan Parker stood beside the old Steinway with the same quiet composure he had shown while pushing a maintenance cart through the hall earlier that day. Nothing about him seemed different. The only thing that had changed was what everyone else finally understood. Claire Montgomery waited until the applause softened before approaching him again. The audience sensed another moment was coming and gradually settled into silence. Ethan smiled politely. You really do not like being the center of attention, do you? Claire asked. A few people nearby laughed gently. Ethan glanced around the hall. I got used to different priorities. Claire studied him for a moment. Is that why you left? The question hung in the air. Not accusatory. Not intrusive. Simply honest. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Around them, the room became still once more. Hundreds of people listened without realizing they were doing so. Claire immediately regretted asking. Yet before she could apologize, Ethan answered. Partly. The single word carried years inside it. Claire remained quiet. Ethan looked toward the empty front row for a moment, as though searching through old memories. There was a time when music was everything. Several musicians in the audience nodded quietly. They understood exactly what that meant. Ethan continued. Every competition mattered. Every review mattered. Every performance felt important. He smiled faintly. I thought I knew what success looked like. The hall remained silent. Ethan's voice never rose above a calm conversation. Yet everyone heard. Every word. Then my wife became sick. The room seemed to exhale softly. Claire lowered her gaze. Ethan did not speak dramatically. He simply told the truth. For a while I tried to balance everything. Concerts, travel, family, doctors, hope. He paused. Life does not always cooperate with plans. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The chandeliers glowed softly above them, while the old Steinway sat quietly beside him like a witness to the story. Ethan looked toward the stage lights. After she passed away, people expected me to keep performing. The words carried no bitterness, only reflection. Some even told me music would help me heal. Claire listened carefully. Did it? Ethan smiled. Sometimes. Then his expression softened. But I had a little girl waiting for me at home. Several audience members glanced at one another. Suddenly the story felt much larger than music. Ethan continued. One day I looked at my calendar. He laughed softly at the memory. Concerts, flights, interviews, rehearsals, everything scheduled down to the minute. He paused again, and I realized the most important person in my life was growing up while I was busy being successful. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause. Claire felt tears gathering again. Across the audience, many others did too. Ethan looked toward the piano. So I made a choice. To leave. Claire asked quietly. Ethan nodded. To be a father first. No dramatic speech followed. No grand declaration. Just a simple truth. Yet somehow that truth affected the room more deeply than any performance had. A retired musician seated near the front slowly wiped his eyes. A young student stared at Ethan with admiration. Richard Lawson lowered his head again, humbled by the realization that greatness sometimes looked very different than people expected. Claire finally understood everything. The disappearance, the silence, the years hidden from public view. Ethan had not abandoned music. He had chosen love. The realization changed the entire story. She looked at him and said softly, "You gave up a legendary career." Ethan shook his head immediately. No, Claire frowned slightly. Ethan smiled. I traded one blessing for another. The answer settled over the audience like sunlight. Nobody could argue with it. Nobody wanted to. Because every person in the room recognized the sincerity behind the words. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. On the screen was a photograph of Lily smiling beside a science project. He looked at the picture for only a second before slipping the phone away again. Yet that single gesture explained more than an hour of conversation ever could. Claire followed his gaze and finally smiled through her tears. She understood now. The world had spent years wondering why Ethan Parker disappeared. The answer had never been hidden. It had simply been waiting at home, doing homework, believing in her father without needing applause. And for the first time all evening, everyone in Montgomery Hall realized that the most remarkable thing about Ethan Parker was not that he had once been a musical prodigy. It was that he had walked away from fame without regret because he already knew what mattered most. The evening air felt cooler as Ethan Parker finally stepped out of Montgomery Hall. The applause had ended. The conversations had faded. The reporters who suddenly wanted interviews had been politely declined. The offers to schedule future performances remained unanswered. Behind him, the grand building still glowed beneath city lights, but Ethan did not look back. He had spent enough years looking backward. Tonight, his thoughts were focused on home. Claire Montgomery stood near the entrance as he prepared to leave. The crowd had mostly dispersed. The parking lot had grown quiet. For the first time all evening, the two of them stood without an audience watching. Claire smiled warmly. You know they are going to talk about tonight for years. Ethan laughed softly. People forget faster than they think. Claire shook her head. Not this. Ethan glanced toward the night sky. Maybe. Claire studied him for a moment. They're going to offer you concerts, tours, opportunities. Ethan smiled. Probably. Will you accept any of them? The question lingered between them. Ethan thought about it honestly. Years earlier, he would have answered. Immediately. Back then, every opportunity felt important. Every invitation felt urgent. Life had taught him a different perspective. Maybe one day, he said. But not because I missed the spotlight. Claire nodded. Somehow she already understood. Because you missed the music. Ethan smiled. The music never left. The answer made her smile too. After a brief goodbye, Ethan climbed into his truck and drove home. The roads were nearly empty. Streetlights reflected softly across the windshield. The city moved around him with its usual rhythm. unaware that one of the most remarkable performances in years had just taken place. Ethan preferred it that way. Fame had once filled his schedule. Peace now filled his life. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the driveway of the small yellow house. A porch light glowed warmly against the darkness. The sight immediately relaxed him. No concert hall had ever felt as welcoming as that simple front porch. Through the living room window, he could see Lily sitting on the couch, surrounded by school papers and colored markers. The moment she heard the truck door close, she jumped to her feet and ran to the front door. Ethan barely had time to step onto the porch before it opened. "You are late," Lily announced with a grin. Ethan laughed. "Good evening to you too. How was work?" Ethan paused. "Interesting." Lily narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "That usually means something happened." Ethan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The familiar smell of home immediately replaced the polished atmosphere of the concert hall. He would have chosen this smell 1,000 times over. "Maybe a few unexpected things happened," he admitted. Lily folded her arms dramatically. "I knew it." Ethan smiled and handed her a small box from a local bakery he had stopped at on the drive home. Her face lit up instantly. "You remembered." "Of course I remembered." They settled onto the couch together. Lily talked about school, a science project, and an upcoming field trip. Ethan listened carefully, asking questions and laughing at the appropriate moments. Nothing about the conversation would appear in newspapers. Nobody would record it. Yet to Ethan, it mattered more than every standing ovation combined. Later that night, after homework was finished and dishes were cleaned, Lily wandered into the living room where an old, upright piano rested against the wall. It was not expensive. It was not famous. It was simply theirs. "Will you play something?" she asked. Ethan looked at the piano for a moment. Then he smiled. "Sure." He sat down on the bench. Lily curled up nearby with a blanket. There were no chandeliers above him now. No audience. No donors. No expectations. Just a father and his daughter sharing a quiet moment at the end of a long day. Ethan placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The melody was simple, gentle, familiar. Lily smiled as the notes filled the room. Outside, the neighborhood settled into peaceful silence. Inside, the music continued softly beneath warm lamplight. Ethan glanced toward his daughter and felt the same certainty he had carried for years. He had not lost the life people imagined. He had chosen the life that mattered most. And as the final notes drifted through the little house and Lily slowly rested her head against his shoulder, the room grew quiet. Not the silence of a frozen concert hall. Not the silence of astonishment. A better silence. The silence of love, dignity, second chances, and a man who finally understood that the greatest audience he would ever have was already home.